Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, it is I am the one and only, Ray the Flying Squirrel here, and I am from the likes of the Maxi Toys videos, as you probably expect at this point in time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll present to you our next, yet another new Let's Play for the channel in 2023, and no matter what though, originally I was expecting to able to try to go ahead and continue things on in Super Mario RPG, but as it turns out about the fact that I'm still working on it for the weekends for the time being. So from now on, we're about able to dive right into yet another Donkey Kong Let's Play for the sake of 2023. And this time we're about to be able to hit on to the forms of the Game Boy Advance of all things, because originally we had decided able to go for Donkey Kong King of Swing, but instead I'm actually going to be focusing on Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Advance. This is basically a remake of the original Donkey Kong Country back on the Super Nintendo, which originally came out in 1994, whilst perfect timing too, because relatively speaking, since this game is going to be expected to become 20 years old this year, so as a result, I figure I'm also able to do this game. So because of that, now technically we've already done Donkey Kong Country back in 2019, thanks to when Daffy Duck has already tackled for that game on the Super Nintendo version most likely. However though, since about the fact that we feel like we're about to able to tackle for yet another version of Donkey Kong Country, but this time on the Game Boy Advance, because as it turns out, not only does it feature the familiar gameplay style on the Super Nintendo version, but also it does have some additional content, like for instance DK Attack, as well as the forms of some extras as you saw in the main menu for about a few seconds ago. In addition to that, some other extras was actually included in this particular version of the game as well. So yeah, you probably get the idea of how this is going to turn out to be. So of course, if you're probably wondering what the actual software I'm going to be using on, I'm going to be playing this on the Game Boy Advance emulator. Well, I was originally trying to able to play the game on the Game Boy player, but I seemed able to haven't exactly used my GameCube for quite some time. Although relatively speaking though, about the fact that I'm sure this will be okay enough, despite the fact that there's going to be a couple of frame rate drops here and there, but I'm sure I'm also able to try to get used to it. So, now of course, similar to the forms of how it does on the Super Nintendo version, you can either play it with one-player mode or two-player team. I believe two-player team, you do need to require the Game Boy Advance cable link, as far as I've heard about it anyway. So, this time around though, I'm going to be by myself, because after all, that the last time we actually experienced something related to Donkey Kong games in general, that's what appears to be back in during the forms of in spring, that me and Mighty did somehow already tackle through Donkey Kong Country Returns, specifically on the Nintendo Wii version. So because of this though, and what makes this a little bit different this time around though, compared to the Super Nintendo version of Donkey Kong Country, is that we actually got ourselves an intro cutscene, meaning about the fact that we can definitely know what the actual plot of the game is going to be all about. So I'm sure about the fact that the actual main story of the game remains the same as the forms of the Super Nintendo version, but the noticeable differences this time is that the actual color palette is a bit washed out, as you can definitely tell. In addition to that though, is about the fact that there are some in-game dialogue here and there, and on top of that, as I said before, there are some cutscenes. So because of that though, I think they'll continue that tradition during the forms of it not only on Donkey Kong Country 2 on the Game Boy Advance, but also in Donkey Kong Country 3 also on the Game Boy Advance as well, to make things a little bit more interesting when it comes to the actual high production values. So, but either way, and it seems about the fact that Diddy Kong is not strong enough to able to take care of one of those crumblings as far as this is concerned. So of course, that Cranky Kong is going to tell us some bit of news about the fact that it looks like the crumblings is up to no good. So reading about the fact that they're trying to steal all this banana stash. So either way, we'll be able to actually investigate for that particular matter though. So either way though, because chances are though about the fact that you can able to actually see the actual some of the similarities for the sake of the forms of any other games in the future, specifically with Donkey Kong Country Returns, although except the fact that it looks like that the Kremlings is actually stolen the banana stash, whilst compared to Donkey Kong Country Returns, the rest of the Tiki gang did somehow manage able to steal the bananas. So either way, and yeah, let's get started with the forms of Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Advance. Now, structurally speaking, it plays pretty much like the forms of how it does on the Super Nintendo version, except now you can able to play the game on the go on the Game Boy Advance. And as you can tell, the first level we're going to be dive right into, or the first world in the game we're about to dive right into, that's what appears to be Kongo Jungle. And to begin with, let's begin with the very first level in Donkey Kong Country, and that is Jungle Hijinks, the most iconic level throughout the entire game. Well, at least for beginners, and especially noticeable with, you know, certain levels throughout. So, anyway, so if we go in here, much like the Super Nintendo version, obviously we'll get ourselves a depression phase of Donkey Kong here, meaning about the fact that we must able to retrieve our stolen banana stash again. So either way, and if you go in here, not only does it give you an extra 1-up, much like the Super Nintendo game, but also out of nowhere we got ourselves a new collectible this time around, which are known as the camera pictures. So I believe for this particular game does have a grand total of 52 of those camera pictures that we can able to find. Certain pictures do need to able to require for not only trying to deal with certain enemies in a specific way, but also about the fact that we need to find them on these specific areas. So, now of course, if you ever experienced the Super Nintendo version of the game before, you know exactly how this game plays out to be, except, as you can tell, that the screen resolution, aside from the fact that, like I mentioned this before, the color palette looks a bit washed out in this version, but I will admit though right away is that I do appreciate about the fact that since on the Game Boy Advance version of this specific game, as you can tell, the actual geometry looks a bit more zoomed out, as opposed to the forms of how it does it on, let's just say, the inferior version of the game, which is of course the Game Boy Color version, where everything else is all too zoomed in, and as a result you have to deal with the forms of screen crunch here and there. So because of that though, that's essentially why I'm sticking around with the Game Boy Advance version of Donkey Kong Country for the time being, because obviously about the fact that I will admit though right away is that this version is pretty underrated, because I will say it's definitely a little bit more up there compared to the forms of how it does it on this atrocious Game Boy Color version, in my opinion. Although the reason why, because of how the fact that, as I mentioned this before, I haven't exactly touched upon the Game Boy Color version for a very, very long time, especially because, my god, I got stuck on a lot of levels on the Game Boy Color version. So, but anyway though, in order able to actually notice about right from the start though, is that we actually got all of the Kong letters during the forms have been jungle hijinks, as you can tell, because in addition about the fact that obviously if you can tell that the actual 100% completion throughout still remains the same as the Super Nintendo version, like you can still able to try to find bonus areas and all that stuff by simply trying to able to do some different stimulations when it comes to likely discovering the forms of the actual bonus rooms by simply either just use Rampy the Rhinoceros, as you can tell, with the first animal buddy in the forms of the entire Donkey Kong Country industry. So, but either way though, that might be saying something. So, again, there's not much else I can talk about for this version, apart from the fact that, well, as I mentioned this before, in addition about the fact that it might able to actually bring camera pictures, that is actually another collectibles you can able to collect, but also about that particular point where in order able to fully 100% the game this time around, is that was before when Donkey Kong Country Returns exist, and especially noticeable with the forms of Donkey Kong Jungle Climber for the Nintendo DS, and especially noticeable with the forms of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. In order able to fully 100% the game this time around, is that not only need to find every single bonus areas, but also about the fact that we need to get every single Kong letters, but that doesn't end up here, because you do need to able to obtain every single pictures for your camera. So because of this though, yeah, there's a lot of collectibles in this game this time around, or specifically for this version for that matter. I know technically about the fact that the Game Boy Color version also has some gem-packed full of content here and there as well, but all it gets is just basically just some functions like, I don't know, the feathers or something like that, or perhaps even maybe the actual paper or piece of yellow paper, which actually functions as a Game Boy player accessory. So, but either way though, that might be saying something, I suppose. So of course, as always, in the journey forms of any other Donkey Kong Let's Plays for that matter, I'm obviously going to be going for 100% completion. So, yeah, you probably get the idea about the actual structure of this thing itself. But the only major difference is this time around though, I will admit though right away, there might be a couple of times I will die occasionally, because if you couldn't tell already about the fact that we now need to utilize less buttons to work with, because obviously the Game Boy Advance, along with the Game Boy Color as well, that they seems about the fact that they are pretty lacking when it comes to the forms of how many buttons you have. Like, we don't have the X and Y buttons anymore, so instead, that we can now able to actually press the A button to jump, and especially noticeable, just hold down the B button to run, and eventually you might as well able to grab something like the barrels and all that stuff. But there's also another change in this version compared to the forms of how it does it on the Super Nintendo original, is that in order to able to save the game this time around, well, you simply just pause the game onto the world map, and you see that Game Boy Advance cartridge icon onto the left right there. That is how you save the game, and also you can now able to actually see the level status, as you can see. So in addition about the fact that it tells you how much bonus areas you found, and especially noticeable if you ever accomplished the con letters for the sake of each and every single level. So yeah, it does fill to the brim with a lot of content in this version of the game, which I honestly appreciate about that, even though despite, again, the visual presentation feels a bit washed out in this version, as I said before. But of course, the actual levels themselves are pretty much intact compared to the forms of how it does on the Super Nintendo version, except, you know, as I said before, the visuals do look a bit washed out, especially noticeable on the Game Boy Advance. So, because usually, relatively speaking, when it comes to, like, certain Super Nintendo games get ported over to the Game Boy Advance, always seem to have this little current thing about the fact that the color scheme is a bit washed out, but even then, no, that might be saying something, I guess. So but anyway, so a few things I want to explain from this point today, and that's what appears to be about the fact that today's date, of course, is the 8th of August today, in this case in 2023 today. I can't even believe it's been about a year ago since when Sonic the Hedgehog 2, the movie, on DVD and Blu-ray, including 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray, has already came out for about a year ago for the UK version. So because of that though, oh, and another thing too about the fact that unfortunately though, our holiday vacation for this month is, you know, cancelled. Probably because about the fact that, unfortunately though, there's a lot of accidents recently. In addition to that, there's some tons of roadworks everywhere, which as a result, we ended up just trying to able to cancel out the forms of the holiday vacation as we're expectable to, for the sake of the forms of this month. But thankfully, we're able to actually get ourselves at the very least, a replacement holiday break for specifically until next month, which appears to be on September. So because of that though, I'm sure that I'll explain more details about that, specifically when it gets to the point when I'm deciding to go back onto Super Mario RPG at some point in this weekend, because it seems it's kind of interesting because I'm actually going to be tackling through 2 games by myself, starring me, Ray the Flying Squirrel, of course, because even then though, after all, that as far as what Tiana, she's already explained about this already, that it's kind of unfortunate that Sonic has to delay more continuation parts of Sonic Frontiers, and especially noticeable because as far as what Tiana, she's already said before, that Sonic suffers the forms of sickness bug recently. So because of that, hopefully he'll be better by that time, but either way though, I think between both Sonic and Silver for this point right now seem to have a lot of struggles with the forms of trying to catch up with some more uploading schedules recently. So, but even then though, I'll promise you guys, when it gets to the point until likely also by the end of this year, and especially noticeable with the forms of next year coming up, hopefully we should be back on track and we should be steady for the most part when it comes to uploading schedules alike. So, yeah, that's what I was thinking about it anyway. So, next, potentially speaking though, is about the fact that I'm pretty sure that Tiana, she's almost finishing up everything for the sake of the forms of Merry Mega Land, for the sake of the forms of Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, before she's able to actually just to say about the fact that she's probably going to be able to actually tackle through extra mode for once, especially noticeable because relatively speaking though, that she never does that on the original game, because as a result about the fact that, well, I'm pretty sure about the fact that it might actually contain some more stuff here and there. So either way, again, it's a bit tricky to explain because I know for a fact it's been about quite a few days ago since I actually mentioned something like this. So either way, let's see what we got here. It looks like we've gotten everything for Reptile Rumble. So either way, I suppose we can now able to move on to the next level, which is, of course, the very first water level in the entire Donkey Kong Country series, specifically Coral Capers. So, now of course, if you follow me for the Super Nintendo version Let's Play back in 2019, thanks to, again, Daffy Ducky's already tackled for that game, basically every single underwater levels does not contain any bonus areas. That wasn't until when before Donkey Kong Country 2 and Donkey Kong Country 3, presumably, does manage to contain bonus areas. So, anywho though, and I don't suppose if you noticed, but most of the time, since I'm playing this on the emulator of course, there might be a couple of times where the frame rate might tend to able to get a lot of freaky-ish about it. So, but either way though, I do apologize for this point folks, but regardless of such though, the quality itself is a bit average, which as a result, again, I was expecting to try to able to play this on the Game Boy player, but I haven't exactly touched upon my GameCube for some time. Especially noticeable, I have some lot of struggles with the forms of my GameCube recently, thanks to the forms of the laser system. Like, it just refuses to able to read any discs sometimes. Like, every time it just goes like this weird sound effect, and as a result, it just keeps on bringing up the forms of an error has occurred. Luckily, it's nothing to do with the forms of the disc has been scratched or anything, it's just my actual GameCube hardware itself. I mean, what is this, like a similar situation as my Sega Dreamcast's stupid random resetting itself issue all over again? I'm guessing because of its age, I guess, so, but either way though, but it still works from time to time, so either way though, that's a prime example about the fact that I haven't exactly touched upon my GameCube version of Pac-Man World 3 for some time, especially because at one point I did somehow manage to able to test that game out after when it arrives back in during the forms of about a few weeks ago, and for the most part it works fine enough, but it wasn't until we were able to actually hop into that particular elevator part in the forms of in the very first level in Pac-Man World 3 then the game obviously crashed before the actual save point, and as a result, yeah, I just have no words able to think about why my GameCube decides to able to go ahead and send me the actual "an error has occurred" kind of message, which is a little bit inconsistent, especially noticeable because concerning about that particular point where I did have a lot of fun with it now, especially noticeable after all, we've now somehow got 3 versions of Pac-Man World 3, as a matter of fact, which I know for a fact that we've already on about that already, so either way, alright, Barrel Cannon Canyon. So, you know what this level is going to be involved around in? Is of course a lot of emphasis on barrel blasting. So of course that these types of levels are pretty difficult, especially noticeable during later on. And what makes this a little bit difficult this time around is that you now need to rely on screen crunch. So because of that, whilst unlike the forms of how it does it on any other games like Super Mario Advance and as well as the forms of Super Mario Advance 2, Super Mario World, and heck, even especially noticeable with Yoshi's Island and Super Mario Bros. 3 for the likes of Super Mario Advance 4, that basically though is about the fact that you always have to deal with the forms of that, you know, gosh darn screen crunch, and it's so hard to tell what's on the horizon. But either way though, I will must say is that the controls for the most part in the Game Boy Advance version of Donkey Kong Country is fine enough, but there are a couple of times though that you might able to actually get slippery at one point, which that'll be my only gripe I have with this version of the game to me though, is that I feel like the controls and the momentum feels a bit kind of slippery at points. But I will say it's definitely a little bit better than the forms of how it does it on the Game Boy Color version to me though, because my god, the amount of momentum you have to put up with, jeez, it just feels a bit stiff. Like, way more stiffer than the forms of how it does it. Like, I would say about the fact that I almost assumed that Donkey Kong Land 1 was bad enough for the sake of the actual momentum and physics, but nothing even compares to the forms of the atrocious Game Boy Color version of Donkey Kong Country 1. I know I keep on about that anyway, so let's just go ahead and keep on playing the Game Boy Advance version of Donkey Kong Country, despite the fact that I've wasted 2 lives so far. That's just because about the fact that, again, you can't really tell what's up ahead, so you have to take a massive guess for the most part. And even then though, if you manage to able to try to find certain bonus areas, well, good luck for that. Especially noticeable because, well, I know for a fact that it's been a very long time since I actually have last played the original Donkey Kong Country. I think the last time I actually played that game was on the Super Nintendo Classic Mini, and I did somehow manage to able to fully 100% everything, or should I say 101% the game. So as a result, I did have a really great time with the game, despite how difficult that game can be sometimes, especially in certain levels. So Well, thankfully though, about the fact that once we get to the 4th world in this version of the game, at the very least saving the game is not so much of an issue this time, so you can able to save the game at any points this time. Meaning about the fact that when it comes to certain other, like, familiar Kongs we might able to actually meet up with, obviously that, Cranky Kong remains the same. It just gives you some, hints and tips every once in a while if you manage able to actually keep on exploring throughout the game. However, for Funky Kong as well as Candy Kong actually offers a lot differently. So as a result about that particular point, although you're still able to actually experience funky flights after all, but there is a catch to this though, and that's what appears to be about the fact that this version of the game also brings us some bonus games every once in a while. So but either way though, let's go ahead and fall out here, because obviously we did somehow get ourselves one of those familiar animal buddy tokens so that we can able to once again able to actually access to the bonus area as one of those animal buddies specifically. It could be either be the forms of Rambi or On Guard the Swordfish, and especially noticeable with the forms of let's just say during the forms of that specific point with Espresso the Ostrich, and especially noticeable with that frog animal buddy, which I know for a fact it's been a very long time since I've last played this game, since on not only on my Super Nintendo Classic Mini, but also about the fact that with the Game Boy Advance version as well, which I did somehow manage to get myself the original cartridge for it, luckily. What's even weird is that the Game Boy Advance version of Donkey Kong Country, along with 2 and 3, never saw light of day on the actual Wii U Virtual Console re-release version, so I've obviously have no idea. But as a result, at the very least they've got themselves the Super Nintendo version though, so I guess it's that. Oh, and by the way, if you stumble across into an exclamation mark, this actually represents you've actually completed everything in each level, so... But anyways, let's go ahead and check out with Funky Kong right here, and not only does he able to actually have himself funky flights, as you can tell, but also he got himself a special game. Something relates to fishing. Oh boy, I can totally see what this is going. Especially noticeable, I wonder about the fact that it's almost like the exact same concept, or the exact same idea as Big the Cat from the likes of Sonic Adventure, but I suppose we'll try to able to investigate the actual fishing minigame just to able to check it out. So... But either way though, that's all I can usually say about the forms of some differences anyway between not only the original Super Nintendo version, but also during the forms within the Game Boy Advance version as well. So, although, here's a fun fact for you, I was originally trying to able to actually do a Let's Play of DuckTales Remastered on the PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 front, but as a result, that unfortunately though, I just couldn't get around to it, especially noticeable about the fact that I believe that when it comes to the point until possibly by the end of this month or something, I believe that particular game is going to become 10 years old during that time, which I know for a fact that I was originally trying to able to do that Let's Play for you guys, but change of plans because of Donkey Kong Country Game Boy Advance version's 20th anniversary celebration, so yeah, I'm really sorry about this point, folks, but either way, this is how the Funky's fishing plays out to be. Obviously, you need to catch a certain amount of fishes before the time runs out, so obviously we need to aim for 20 fishes, so for the most part, the beginning portion is not too bad, but when it gets to the later portion of this, my god, it gets tremendously difficult. Like, this particular kind of game like this, it feels very similar to the forms of how it does in one of those, make your way to the distance for that fishing rod from the likes of Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. So, but either way though, except the fact that we obviously going to be able to catch a ride with On Guard the Swordfish. Oh, and by the way, the more you catch those certain fishes, specifically at the moment, we can only catch red fishes for that part. Basically though, the more you catch them, likely also if you manage to able to call like 2 or 3, sometimes you get yourselves a combo, so I think it's worth bringing up. And on top of all that stuff though, if you accidentally catch the wrong colored fish, I believe you somehow take away time, so yeah, something to keep in mind. So anyway, so here's another differences between the Super Nintendo version compared to this version right here, is that originally on the Super Nintendo version of Donkey Kong Country, that normally Candy Kong does allow you to able to actually save the game. But as it turns out, in this version in particular, she can now able to actually host her dance studio. meaning about the fact that we're about to be doing a DDR kind of stuff. So because of that though, I think there was actually 2 different rewards depending on you how good you are when it comes to playing this particular mini game like this. Like, I know for a fact that for one thing in mind, that if you do manage able to complete the actual stage as normal, then you should able to actually get one of those specific rewards, like the actual camera picture and stuff like that. But if you try to do a perfect run, you also get yourselves a special reward if you manage to get yourselves a perfect run, at least in one of those specific candies, you know, dance studio as far as this is concerned. Although luckily though, we can able to actually do the perfect run very easily thanks to the forms of the actual easiest of the actual Candy's Dance Studio, believe it or not. Especially noticeable because not only is it incredibly short, but it's also a lot more slower. In addition to that though, about the fact that, well, I found this one to be a little bit easier compared to the other ones coming up. So, and as a result, the more you do well enough, then you also get yourself some 1-ups, which, as to be expected, is so easy to get extra lives in this game. So, anyways, here we go with the very first boss in the game, which appears to be by the forms of Grunty right here. So, Grunty the beaver is without doubt the easiest fight in the game. Just jump on his head for approximately 4 or 5 times. Then once you've done so already, then obviously I think you guys able to hit on him for about 5 times. And, well, he's done. Easiest boss done, and there we go. We got ourselves a nice little banana right here. And after when you beat a certain boss, Cranky Kong shows up, which meaning about the fact that it tells you specific stuff for that matter. So, but either way though, that pretty much takes care of the forms of Kongo Jungle. So we can now move on to Monkey Mines. So, but either way though, before we get onto the forms of Monkey Mines, is that we need to able to go back onto the forms of you know, Kongo Jungle just to able to wrap things up for some parts. For instance, about the fact that, as you probably already noticed, we've almost completed every level in this world as Donkey Kong, because as it turns out, there's also another picture you can able to claim. That's what appears to be about the fact that, well, I'll show this off until whenever we go back onto the forms of Candy's Dance Studio, first of all. Yeah, as you can tell, there aren't any bonus areas in one of those water levels in the game, so let me just save my game. So anyways, let's go back in here, and before we get onto that though, let me double check on the scrapbook, and as a result, that's what the actual picture camera is for. So because of that, the more you obtain those specific camera items, basically it allows you to unlock certain concept arts, or specifically the character images based off from not only certain animal bodies, as well as the forms of enemies, and even the rest of the Kong family of members, and especially noticeable with the forms of if you manage to beat a certain world, then obviously about the fact that you can able to actually claim certain camera pictures and stuff like that, which I will say, it does add a lot of replay value, which I'm sure most of you are able to enjoy this sort of thing, but either way though, that might be saying something, so anyways though, so let's just go ahead and hop right back onto the forms of Candy's Dance Studio, as I said before, because this time around though, I'm going to be going for a perfect run on this particular point. And what makes this a little bit tricky to me though, is that you need to time yourselves perfectly in order to able to actually just try to able to get one of those rewards. Because my god, whenever I managed able to play this on my own time back in during the forms of, not too while ago actually, my button input reaction timing feels a bit off. So as a result, you need to be dead on with the actual timing. So because of that though, pay attention to where the outline square was. So as a result, you can only press for about a few multiple directions for the most part. Like currently we're only pressing left and right now, and eventually towards the end we're only going to be pressing the B button as a matter of fact. So now, of course, as I said before, the more worlds we're going to be going to, that sometimes it gets a bit more difficult at some point. So either way, and there goes our perfect run.
Time up.
And that way we can able to not only get ourselves the glorious photo picture as far as what Candy's gonna brings us into, but also, of course, more extra lives. So that should be pretty swell. And for those of you probably wondering that, yeah, it does have 3 different colored 1-up balloons. For those of you able to actually notice, ever since on the Super Nintendo version of this particular Let's Play in mind, Obviously, red ones give you 1, green balloons gives you 2, and finally blue ones give you about roughly 3. So obviously it continues that tradition in the rest of the forms of the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, for not only on the Super Nintendo but also during the forms in the Game Boy Advance remake as well. So anyway, let me quickly go back into this level again. Although this might potentially be the last time we're going to be seeing this level, believe it or not. Because as a result, in order to able to get yet another picture, you need to able to complete one of the worlds completely as Donkey Kong or Diddy Kong, depending on the forms of the completionist run. So as a result, at the moment right now, that Coral Capers is the only level left for completing the level as Donkey Kong. So yeah, keep that in mind though, especially noticeable at that particular point where, luckily I'm only going to do one of those specific moments twice, by the way, so just so I'm sure about the fact that we can able to actually claim one of the photos. So yeah, let me know in the comments down below for the question of the day. Which version do you prefer when it comes to playing the original Donkey Kong Country game? I will still say that the Super Nintendo is a little bit more superior in my opinion, especially noticeable about the fact that how amazing the visuals are. In addition to that though, about the fact that I really still enjoy the ambience as well as the soundtrack on the Super Nintendo version. Although I will say the worst version of the game for me though is the Game Boy Color version, the most inferior version of the game because of all that, you know what I'm saying, with the screen crunch and all that stuff, which I think I've already pointed out since earlier on in this particular game. So anyway, so as you can tell, we've somehow gone to the forms of Espresso's bonus stage. So because of that though, now in order to able to get the photo album, or specifically gain the next photo, you need to get about 600 of those specific tokens, because once you reach a certain, like I somehow did right there, that way it allows me to not only gain more extra lives, but also about the fact that it gives me yet another camera picture. So that should be all pretty swell if I do say so for myself. So, I could possibly name about the forms of certain other news to discuss, but I think I will say it that I think I should probably let Tiana be able to actually mention more about, for the sake of the forms of news updates or anything else to be more specific. So because of that though, yeah, for the most part about the fact that in the first world it's not too difficult, even though it's kind of a shame I did die twice during the forms of that particular first barrel cannon stage throughout the game. That's just because about the fact that sometimes I will admit though right away, I do need to get used to it, the momentum as well as the forms of the screen crunch resolution at one point. But as a result of that matter though, it really doesn't matter to me anyway, so oh jeez. Well, good thing we did somehow switch over to Donkey Kong in just in the nick of time, because the exit sign is just right there. And from here, once you're done with that, basically you get yourselves yet another picture photo, which, for instance, if we go back into the scrapbook, and if we scroll all the way to where the Kong family catalog is, and exponentially speaking though, that way it should show up the next picture, which actually signifies Donkey Kong himself. So even then though, and there's the Espresso right there, for those of you curious. And speaking of Donkey Kong, there he is right here. So, now I think there's also another camera picture we can able to obtain, but it only requires Donkey Kong, by the way, because you can able to actually do a hand slap attack if you manage to able to try to do it like anywhere else. So, for instance, let's go back onto Jungle Hijinks quickly. So just in case we can able to take care of one of those enemies in particular. So for instance, about the fact that, well, exponentially I somehow accidentally got hit by that particular enemies right there, so. But then again though, as I said before, it only requires Donkey Kong to do it, so hand slap down here, and that way we get another picture. Luckily though, if you can't be bothered able to leave the level, like going from point A to point B, luckily though you can able to actually pause the game and just try to able to leave by simply press the select button. So either way though, that's as far as I can usually think about it. So with that pretty much takes care of the rest of Kongo Jungle. So with that, let's go and catch a ride with the forms of Funky's Flight and move on straight on to World 2. So with that being said, well, I think we should probably end things off this point right here. So join me next time for more of Let's Play of Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Advance version. That's what it appears to be we're going on to Monkey Mines. So yeah, this will be interesting. So I'll see you guys until on Thursday. Later, fellas.